Hello, everyone, and welcome to another ArcESB webinar. My name is Matt, and I'm here with Ron, and today is the third in a series of 3 webinars where we cover a full end-to-end EDI integration. And today we'll be talking about the data transformation and mapping step of an integration, always an important part. So to give you a sense of what we'll be talking about today, we'll start with a brief presentation where we introduce the application, talk a little bit about what we covered in the other 2 episodes. Then we'll jump into a live demonstration of the translation and mapping features of ArcESB. And finally, we'll open up the floor for a live Q&A. So if you have questions about the application, don't quite understand something going on during the presentation, please drop those questions down in the chat and we will get to them towards the end. All right, Ron, so to help frame this whole series, we introduced a fictional company and their use case. Do you mind reminding us about that fictional company and what they're looking to do?
Certainly, Matt, and thank you so much for that introduction. A very good afternoon to all of our viewers. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who watched our first and second webinars, you will know that we talked about an example company that we called Wholesale Suppliers. Now, Wholesale Suppliers is a manufacturing business that would like to sell its products on Amazon's platform. To do this, they obviously need a system to exchange business documents with Amazon. And since they have a large volume of transactions on a daily basis, they would like to do this over the AS2 file transfer protocol, just to make sure everything is secure and reliable. So Amazon invites Wholesale Suppliers to Vendor Central, and once they get themselves set up there, they have the requisite information from Amazon to set up that AS2 connection. But that's not it. They actually have an additional need as well. And this need is to integrate the information that's coming from Amazon with their backend system, which in this case is a Microsoft SQL Server. So in a sentence, I can sum all of that up as Wholesale Suppliers needs to receive 850 purchase orders from Amazon, insert them into a SQL Server database, and then extract data from the same database to then send back to Amazon as 810 invoices. Now, as Matt mentioned, this is the third webinar of a 3-part webinar series, and I'm going to go ahead and drop a link in the chat to our first and second webinar, which are available on our website. But Matt, in the interest of those who may have missed those 2 webinars, let's go ahead and do a brief recap of them.
Certainly. So we started with a brief introduction of ArcESB as an application. And we talked about how it's a web application that you can deploy anywhere. So that's on-premise, in the cloud. You can even rent instances via Amazon or Azure Marketplace. Then we talked a little bit about the 3 major categories of features that ArcESB has, namely that's managed file transfer, data transformation, and backend integration. Then we introduced everyone to the workflow canvas where you drag and drop our connectors to create custom business workflows. Then in the first webinar, we did a live demonstration of configuring an AS2 connection. So we set up an AS2 profile with our AS2 information. We set up an AS2 connector with Amazon's AS2 information so that we can securely send and receive EDI files. Then in the second webinar, we set up a database connector, specifically Microsoft SQL Server. And we configure not just a connection to that SQL Server, but also some input and output templates so that we can insert data and select data from specific database tables. So at this point, we've got most of our flow configured, ready to go, and we're ready to fill in the gaps. Ron, in order to know how we best make forward progress, can you talk about the shape of this flow at a high level?
Absolutely. So for those of you who attended last time, you will recall this abstraction, but for these kinds of end-to-end integration use cases, I like to abstract them into 3 general modules. Firstly, I like to think about the very front end of the use case, which I call the AS2 module. And this obviously involves setting up your AS2 profile, an AS2 connector, and then going ahead and exchanging files with Amazon over AS2. That was the subject of our first webinar, so we can go ahead and check that off our list. The second module I like to think about is the very back end of this use case, which I call the integration module. And this involves connecting to a backend database like SQL Server, or even an application, like an ERP system or a CRM, and interacting with that data source by extracting data from it and inserting data to it. And that was the subject of our second webinar, so we can check that off as well. Now, the third and final module is the subject of today's webinar, and I call this the EDI translation and mapping module. As you can tell from its name, this involves translating the incoming X12 documents or EDI documents, and then mapping and preparing the data that is contained in those documents so that they're ready for further processing, which in this case is that database integration. So today we're going to do a deep dive into this EDI translation and XML mapping and give you a live walkthrough of this final module. Once we're able to do this, you'll see that we can actually connect the front and the back end of this integration with this middle module. And once we do that, we will allow the seamless flow of data in and out of the system completely automatically. But Matt, before we get started with the live demonstration, can you tell us what we need to know about ArcESB heading into this module?
Yeah, there is something very important to understand about Arc before we dive into the live demonstration. And that is that ArcESB uses XML as the common data format for any mapping or translation features. So we know that our customers have lots of different data formats. You might have EDI files like X12 or EDIFACT or HL7. You might have flat files like CSV, Excel. You might have JSON files, the list goes on. So we need a way of unifying all those different file formats and dealing with a nice common medium. And we use XML for that. So very commonly in a ArcESB flow, you'll translate data into XML early on in the flow, and then maybe do some magic with it. And then later in the flow, if you need, translate that XML back into some other data format. The other important thing to understand about Arc's use of XML, and you might recall this if you watched our second webinar, is that Arc interfaces with databases and other backend systems through XML. So Arc models database queries like selects and inserts as XML templates. So Arc doesn't just use XML to unify different file formats, but also to interface with databases. So Ron, we're going to have lots of XML flying around today. Can you help us understand what we're doing with all that XML?
Sure, Matt. So you hit the nail on the head. XML is extremely important in ArcESB as a common data format, as you just mentioned. And what we need to realize is that when we're working with this integration, we're going to have two different XML formats that we actually need to deal with. As Matt, you just talked about, we're going to have these EDI translations happening where we convert EDI files into XML. So the very first format is this EDI translated XML. And the image you're seeing is just a very simple example of that. From the second webinar, we know that we used certain XML templates to create interactions with databases. So that's that second XML structure we need to worry about. So now what we're looking at are two different XML structures, and we actually have a need here. And the need is to have the data in one structure mapped to the data in another structure. So as a result, this mapping of data from one XML structure to another is actually super crucial and very important in ArcESB. And Arc actually has some very user-friendly tools that are graphical and pretty powerful that allow you to do just that. And we're going to demonstrate that in just a few minutes.
Yeah, and hopefully it's become clear here that the middle module that we're focusing on today, this translation and mapping module, really has two separate halves. It has the translation step, where we translate some file format, in this case EDI, into XML, so that we get XML as that nice common medium. And then there's the mapping step, where everything is already XML and we need to transform one XML structure into the other, so we connect these two different data sources all in the same flow. So we're going to walk through both of those today in this live demonstration. And without any further ado, I am going to hop right into a view of the application. So here we are looking at ArcESB. This is the flows canvas where you configure your custom workflows. And you'll notice that we already have two connectors here from our previous webinars. So first we have this AS2 connector, which is all configured with Amazon's AS2 information, so we can send and receive EDI files with Amazon. And we have our SQL Server connector. So we configured this in the second webinar. And not only does it have this connection to a local SQL Server instance, but it also has some input and output templates to insert data and select data from specific tables. And in case you missed the second webinar, or maybe just to jog your memory, I do want to quickly look at this input template so that you can see that ArcESB is rendering this as an XML file, as an XML structure. So this is the XML interface with databases that I alluded to earlier. And our job here is to make sure that our input files to this connector fit this XML structure. If they do, then this connector will know how to package this up into a SQL query and insert the data into our backend database. So we've got these two configured connectors. We've got some space in between to fill in the gaps. Ron, how should we start?
Absolutely. So I think the best way to start is to look at those two halves that you just described, Matt. So that very first half is the EDI translation step, right? So we need a connector to translate incoming X12 documents into XML. And I'd like to introduce our EDI set of connectors here. So Matt, if you could open that up, the viewers will see that we have a whole range of connectors that allow you to translate EDI files of all kinds of different formats. Now we know that Amazon uses X12, so let's go ahead and drop that into our canvas. Let's call it X12 inbound for any kind of incoming files from Amazon. And let's look at the connector settings. Now the keen eye will notice right off the bat that the X12 connector can be configured to translate either from X12 to XML or from XML to X12. So that's that translation type field we're looking at right now. And if you look a little further down within the interchange settings, you see that we need to configure both sender and receiver IDs. And we need to do this so that the connector can appropriately validate any incoming message by making sure that it's coming from the right sender and is addressed to the right receiver. So keeping both of these settings in mind, the translation type setting and the interchange setting, it becomes apparent that each X12 connector, so a single X12 connector, is designed for one-way conversion, so either X12 to XML or XML to X12, and it's designed to be used only with one trading partner. And that's because we have this validation built into the connector. However, I want to clarify that apart from these two things, you're not going to be restricted at all in the volume of files that this connector will be able to process. So the number of files is really a non-issue. And also in the types of X12 documents that it can translate. So for this example, we're going to be looking at it at an 850, but really this connector can translate any other file, whether that's a 997 or absolutely anything else. As I said, for this example, we're going to keep things a little simple and work just with an incoming 850. So Matt, let's go ahead and start configuring this connector so that it's able to translate files that are coming from Amazon. So the first thing we're going to do, of course, is make sure that the translation type is set to X12 to XML because we want to translate incoming files. And the next thing we want to do is go ahead and configure the sender and receiver IDs. Now we know both of these are mutually defined, so the qualifiers are going to be the ZZ mutually defined qualifiers. For Amazon, the identifier is Amazon BS, and we expect you'd have this information if you were doing this yourself. And the receiver identifier for our example company is WS-suppliers for wholesale suppliers. Now, once this is done, the connector is practically ready to go ahead and translate the files. But there are a few other settings that I want to touch on before moving on. As you can see that we have an acknowledgement section here where you can simply check off the need to send off an automatic 997, for example. For this example, we won't be doing that, but the capability is there. And we also have some automation settings there, which will allow you to dictate whether you want to automatically translate files or leave that be a manual process. That just goes to show that we have these features there available for those who might need it. So with all of this covered, Matt, we're ready to go ahead and translate an X12 file. So let's see how this translation works in real time.
All right, so I have an X12 file prepared that would be just like we had received it from Amazon. So I'll go ahead and upload this 850 X12 file here in the connector. But before I actually send it through, and this is part of why I disabled automation for a second, I do want to show you the file just so we can see this nice before and after. So I am going to download the file. 1 second here. JavaScript issue here. So I am going to download the file. There we go. So here we see this X12 file as we would have just received it from Amazon. So it's not particularly human readable, but it's got all of our sales order, our purchase order information. And we know we eventually want this to look like our database template. and it's a pretty long ways off from that. So the first step, though, is going to be to convert this into XML. And I can show you how this looks by sending it through this X12 connector that we just configured. So as you can see here, there is a larger flow canvas that this particular flow is a part of. Obviously, we're showing you one specific part of it here. And I just got my connectors mixed up. All right, I apologize. Let's go back to this unsent X12 file, which I just showed you, and send it through the connector. So when I'm using the correct connector, it naturally sends just fine, and I'll download this XML file that resulted. All right, let's see. So I think there's a slight issue with my browser right now. Just executing that dialog. All right, so here we have an XML representation of that EDI data we were just looking at. So you can see it's still a little ugly. It's not quite the XML structure that we want for our database template, but we're definitely making progress. It is now in an XML format. And you'll notice that there are all these XML comments that are providing some context to the specific EDI segments. So this can be helpful if you're not quite as personally familiar with the EDI specs themselves. Maybe the letters and numbers by themselves don't mean as much to you. These XML comments, obviously they don't impact the data, but are there to provide some helpful user information. So with this showing of the before and after the X12 to the XML, I think we can hop back into the application and make some more progress.
So Matt, I think before we proceed on to that second half that you mentioned, I'd like to take a look at some of our other EDI connectors. So let's open up the EDI connectors there again. And so obviously everyone can see that we have a whole host of different EDI connectors. And let's just choose a very popular one, EDIFACT, for example. And the reason I'm doing this is just to show our viewers just how identical it is to set up as it compared to the X12 connector. So it's practically the same kinds of settings.
Right, that's a good point. So we're going to be focusing a lot on X12 today. That's what our example company, Wholesale Suppliers, needs. But it's just worth pointing out that regardless of the particular EDI standards you use, these same principles apply. So you could plug in this EDIFACT connector for the X12 connector in our example flow. You see we have the same one-way translation. We have the same interchange settings to validate the sender and receiver, and so on. So we're not going to spend too much time talking about EDIFACT specifically. But if you're worried that you don't use X12 specifically, just understand that the same principles apply to whatever EDI connector you want to use. So with that said, I am going to go ahead and delete this EDIFACT connector to return to our specific use case here. So we've got an example of this EDI translation. We're translating X12 into XML. I showed you a brief before and after. I think it's worth opening up the floor in case there are any questions specific to EDI translation. We're going to get into the mapping step in just a bit. Just want to make sure that there aren't any lingering questions before we move on. Ron, has anybody suggested anything?
Yeah, so there are a few questions, and I think there's some good ones in here. So we can go ahead and take a few minutes to answer them. So first of all, this user is asking if they can choose which schema this X12 or EDIFACT connector uses to translate EDI.
Right. Okay. So that's a good question. And this user seems to understand that these EDI files are processed, they're parsed using some specific document schema. And ArcESB comes with many, many common EDI document schemas so that it can parse your inbound documents. That's what this connector was doing when it parsed that EDI file into XML. If you happen to be using a schema that doesn't come packaged with the application, maybe you're using an older version or some less common document, then you can always go to our website. We offer all of those schemas for free. Simply download them from arcesb.com/schemas, I believe is the URL. And you can find any of the schemas you need so that this connector can read from them.
Right, and I'm going to drop that link into the chat as well for the person who asked the question, so that you can see that those are available for download as well. All right, Matt, we have another question about so this user would like to configure multiple sender and receiver IDs in one connector. And for this, I think we have to go back to how we started explaining what this connector was all about. The way that it's designed is that it's restricted to a one-way translation, so either X12 to XML or XML to X12, and it's restricted to one trading partner only. So if you're looking to use multiple sender and receiver IDs, we'd recommend you create a different connector for that second sender, since you have, it looks like you have more than one partner. Matt, I think we have time for one more question, and
All right.
this user, okay, great. So this user is asking about a 999 acknowledgement instead of a 997.
Yes, so we have the 997 up here on the screen. They might have noticed functional acknowledgement. If you need a technical acknowledgement, which is a 999, it's a simple drop down here in the settings tab. So just a simple, we're not going to focus too much on acknowledgements here for the purpose of data mapping. But yeah, that's a simple field here in the connector settings.
Awesome. So I think, Matt, we've done a good job of covering the EDI translation step that you mentioned right at the start. And thank you so much for those questions, everybody. Let's move on to the next step of the flow here. So we broke down that EDI translation and mapping module into two halves. The first half being EDI translation, which I think we've covered with our EDI connectors. Now the second half is that XML mapping half, where we need to kind of map one XML format into another. And before we dive into this, Matt, why don't we just look at the data that we're working with, right? We have an input template in our database, and we have this translated EDI. Right. So on the left-hand side, you see that the XML structure represents a translated EDI document. Now, if this document makes no sense to you, you can use the comments included in this XML to make sense of the data that you're looking at. And on the right-hand side, you might recognize from the second webinar we did that this is the input template we created to interact with the sales order table in our SQL Server database. And the task at hand here is actually mapping the data in the left-hand side structure to the right-hand side structure. And so the tool we have in ArcESB that does this is called the XML Map connector. So Matt, let's jump back into ArcESB and drop in that XML Map connector.
All right. And I will name this XML Map 850 to indicate that we are mapping 850 documents into our backend. And I will go ahead and connect this connector to provide this logical data flow, and so that files are automatically passed along through the flow. And I happen to notice here, if I come back to the XML Map connector, that this destination file field is already populated, and it seems to be reading from another connector in the flow. Specifically, it seems to be reading from this SQL Server connector. Ron, do you mind explaining what's going on here and why that might be important?
Absolutely. So I think to begin with, it's good to get a base level understanding of how this connector works. And I think it's kind of intuitive. You can see that it requires some kind of a source file, and it requires some kind of a destination file. And obviously what we're trying to do is map from the source to the destination. Now you can either upload these files, and Matt, we can show this upload dialog that we have. So you can either upload a source and destination file, or actually a neat feature that Arc has is that as long as the connector is connected to other connectors, so in this example, our XML Map connector is connected to the SQL Server connector as well as the X12 connector. So as long as this connection exists in the flow, the application can recognize if there is an existing template waiting on the other end. So that's exactly what's happening here. The connector recognizes that we have the sales order template waiting in the SQL Server connector, and it's already populated that as the destination file. Of course, you can change this if you want, but the application recognizes that as well. So Matt, let's go ahead and upload a similar template file, but in the X12 connector now. And we can do this for any kind of file format, not just X12, but let's go ahead and do this for X12.
All right, so I just showed what happens when I send this sample file through. It translates to XML. But in this case, I don't just want to process the file. I want to use it to create a template, like Ron was saying, that will allow the XML Map connector to detect that template. So instead of uploading files with the normal option, I'll use the special upload test file and choose that same X12 file. And once I've uploaded, that template is all ready to go. And so if I hop back into the XML Map connector, you'll see this populated the source file with that template. It's now detecting from the X12 connector. And you probably couldn't miss that the visual designer here is now populated with the tree structure for both my source and destination. So I'm going to save those templates here, and I'm going to start talking about this mapping data. You want to pop this settings panel out to give us some more screen real estate to start talking about the XML Map connector, which is where all of the magic happens for mapping. So we're about to jump into the details of data mapping, and some of this information might start to feel a little dense. We're going to do our best to provide examples for many of the different important features here in the XML Map connector to give you full control over your mapping. Keep in mind this webinar is being recorded, so if you're following along, but maybe it would help to hear something again, or you want to have this to reference when you're performing your own mapping, keep in mind that that recorded version will be available on our website for you to step through at a later date. So for now, let's jump right into the concepts here in data mapping. So the first thing to understand is that data mapping does require some understanding of the data you're working with. We're going to be dragging elements from our source onto elements in the destination with this visual designer to establish mapping relationships. And in order to do that, you do have to understand what data represents what. So let's talk a little bit about this data. The first thing I want to mention is that there are actually two types of nodes here in the XML map designer. There are what we call parent nodes, and they have children, and you can tell they have children because you can expand and collapse them. But they don't have a value. So these elements that I can expand and collapse don't have values in them. The other type of node is a leaf node. So these don't have any children. You can't expand or collapse them, but they do have a value. For instance, this STO1 has the value of 850. And these values are going to be what we ultimately want to insert into our database. These are the values that pertain to our sales order. So if I hop over to the destination, you can see the same division. We have these parent elements that I can expand. And these represent an insert, in this case, into a database table, namely the sales order table and the associated sales order line items table. Then these leaf nodes that are children of the parent insert are each of the columns in my table that I want to actually insert values into. So this mapping is going to be the task of mapping the values from my source leaf nodes into my destination leaf nodes so that those values are inserted into my database columns. But there is a catch. So these leaf nodes are housed within parent nodes, and these parent nodes might repeat some variable number of times. And my mapping has to capture that potential for repetition, otherwise I might miss out on some leaf nodes entirely. So before I begin thinking about mapping leaf nodes, I need to think about capturing this repetition of parent nodes. So let's take an example to make this a little bit more clear. So I know that this TX401850 element represents a sales order or a purchase order in my EDI document. And it's a parent node, and there might be more than one sales order in the same document. So this TX element might repeat to indicate more than one sales order. Well, I want to be able to capture that repetition to make sure I'm not missing out on sales order data. Well, if this TX element represents a sales order in my EDI, and this sales order parent represents a sales order in my database, I know there needs to be some relationship between these two elements. And the question is, what kind of relationship? Well, in this case, since I want to make sure I'm capturing any repetition, the relationship I need is a for each relationship. That is to say, for each sales order in my source, I want a sales order in my destination. So I'm going to go ahead and drag the element from the source onto the destination to create this relationship. So simply by dragging and dropping, we can see this for each and then a green XPath up here. And I'll take a second to briefly talk about both of these. So this for each keyword. So clearly this is showing that I have established a for each relationship between these two elements. But how did the XML Map connector know that I wanted a for each specifically? I mean, I just told you that I did, but how did the connector know? And that's because that's a very simple answer. Anytime you map a parent element onto another parent element, that relationship is necessarily a for each relationship. And that's because what we care about when we're talking about parent mappings is capturing any possibility for repetition. After all, the values are in leaf elements. So the reason we care about mapping parents is in case they repeat and contain additional leaf nodes. So I've got this for each keyword showing this for each relationship, and I've got this green XPath, and you'll notice it begins with a slash, indicating that it's an absolute path. So this, it might already be clear, is the path in my source document that's mapped to this output node. And I could easily trace through the tree structure in the document to confirm that this TX element is at this path in the source document. Now, I understand that might be a decent amount of information coming at you. So luckily, there is another for each relationship that we need to establish, and that'll give us a chance to revisit these concepts maybe a little bit more quickly. So going back to my understanding of this document, I know that this TX element isn't the only thing that might repeat. I know that these PO1 loops represent a line item in each of my sales orders. And obviously a sales order might have as many line items, might have as many as 100, who knows. So in this case, I have 2, but I want to capture that potential for this to repeat any number of times. So I know that I need another for each relationship. So now I need to figure out which element in my destination corresponds to the same concept as this PO1 loop 1. Well, I just said that this PO1 loop is a line item, and I know that sales order line items represents a line item in my database, so it should be clear that PO1 loop 1 and sales order line items need to have this same for each relationship. Okay, and so we can see this for each appear again because this is a parent to parent mapping, and we see this XPath. And we'll notice that this XPath is quite a bit shorter than this one, and that it doesn't begin with a slash. And that indicates that it is relative to some other XPath. And you can tell that this sales order line items is a child of sales order. It's inside of it. And so since this doesn't begin with a slash, it indicates it's relative to the for each loop that it's inside of. So if I wanted to find the full path to the element that's mapped to this, I would simply concatenate this XPath with the relative XPath that's inside of it. So once I've established both of these for each loops, my mapping has captured any potential for repetition that I care about to make sure that I don't miss any of my leaf nodes.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. So once we've done this mapping from one parent node to another parent node and created the respective for each relationships, we can actually start moving on to mapping the data itself. And as Matt mentioned, that data is usually housed in these leaf nodes, as you can see. Now, all this really requires from our end is a simple drag and drop, a drag from the relevant leaf node in the source to the corresponding leaf node in the destination. And anytime we do this drag and drop relationship, all we're doing is telling the XML map connector that, hey, look at this, this XPath in the source document and grab the data from there and put it into the corresponding destination path. So I don't think there's a better way of understanding this than actually working through a couple of examples. And as an example, I'd like to talk about the purchase order number. Now, this is obviously a very important data point in any EDI document. And my knowledge of the incoming 850 in X12 tells me that that purchase order is stored in the BEG segment. So Matt, if we open that up, we'll see the purchase order number is in the BEG03 segment. And to create this mapping to the purchase order number in the destination, all we need to do is a simple drag and a drop. Let's take this one step further once again for perhaps one of the line item elements right here. So a crucial element here is, of course, quantity ordered. Each line item has some quantity attached to it based on how many of those items are being purchased. And I know that that element is the PO102 element in the source document. So let's go ahead and create that mapping, Matt, with a simple drag and drop. Now, for the sake of brevity, that's all we're going to do for the drag and drop of the leaf nodes, but I would expect you to do the same process for all of the relevant leaf nodes in your process as well. And that wraps up the very basics of the XML mapping, which is a simple drag and drop to create for each relationships between the parents and direct value-to-value relationships between the leaf nodes. Now, I'd like to move on to some of the additional tools we have in this connector. And that's to help you manipulate the data as you're mapping it. And I think a good place to start is a simple conditional.
Yeah, I agree. A conditional is one of the easiest to grasp extra tools that the XML map connector contains. So we've got the basics. We're capturing any repetition in the source. We're mapping the values from the source. And now let's do some logic to these values as we're mapping. So let's take the currency type just as an example to help motivate this feature. Let's say that this currency type output element only needs to appear if the currency isn't USD for US dollars. You can imagine like US dollars is the default. So if it is US dollars, we don't need this at all. We only want it if it's something else. So this allows us to add a conditional rule to only include this element if it's not US dollars. All right, let's see what that would look like. So first, I'm going to do a regular value-to-value mapping. And this is pretty common for most of our advanced mapping tools, is it usually starts with a basic value-to-value mapping, just like Ron was talking about, and then we do something extra to add some extra logic. So in this case, I happen to know that the currency type is held in the CUR02 element, so I'll start with that basic value-to-value mapping. And now I want to add that conditional I was talking about. Only include this in the output if this currency value that I just mapped is not US dollars. Well, to add that conditional, I can use this condition icon to bring up the conditional editor. And I'll add a new rule to enforce this condition I want to add. And I need to pick the element in my source that I'm checking against. So in this case, it happens to be the same element. You might imagine in other cases, you're checking a different element to see if this element appears. But in this case, the currency value is also what I'm checking. And I want to make sure the currency value is not equal to US dollars before I map this to my output. So once I have this very simple rule set up, I can save changes. And you'll see this if keyword appear to indicate that I've added a conditional. So we still have this basic value-to-value mapping here, but we know that this is only going to appear if the if conditional is true. So that's a simple example of how you can add conditions to whether or not data appears in your output. But Ron, sometimes it's not just about whether data appears in your output, but it's about manipulating the data as you're mapping it. Can you walk us through how you might manipulate data with the expression editor?
Yeah, sure. And you're absolutely right, Matt. Oftentimes we have users or customers who need a little bit more control over their data when it's being mapped. And for example, this could be when your data has to match some kind of criteria that you have in your backend system. So you need a little bit more control. And to establish this control, we have a tool in the XML Map connector that we call the expression editor. And as I said, all this does is it gives you a little bit more control than a simple drag and drop, which is what we have been seeing so far. So to introduce you to the mapping editor, I'd like to start off with a very simple use case, and that use case is mapping a static value. So you can imagine there might be some cases in which you absolutely know definitively that a specific element or a specific field in your destination is always going to be the same. For this example, we can imagine that the customer name is always going to be Amazon because this entire mapping is designed for 850s that are coming from Amazon. So I know the customer is always going to be Amazon. So Matt, let's jump into the expression editor in the customer name right here. And right off the bat, you see these square brackets up there. And I'm going to go into what that means in just a second. But for now, Matt, let's just get rid of them and drop in a static value, which is Amazon, because that's who the customer is. And I know that the customer name is always Amazon. So if I save this, I have the ability to define a static value when I know that it's always going to be one thing. Now, obviously, that's a very convenient example, but more often than not, it's not going to be as straightforward as that. So the next thing I want to talk about is actually working with a date time element to actually display the concatenation of two separate values in the source. And this actually relates to a question that we received a few minutes ago. So I'm going to go ahead and address that question specifically. The question is mapping from two different elements in the source to one element in the destination. So for this, I'd like to talk about, let's take the requested shipping date as an example, right? Now we know that the requested shipping date is also an element in the source document, and we know that it's in the DTM segment. As you can see, DTM02 contains the date, and DTM03 contains the time. And personally, in my database, I would like to see both the date and the time concatenated so that they're one element. So they're one string that has the date followed by the time. How do I do this? And what we're going to do is use the expression editor to facilitate this. So as Matt mentioned, we're going to start off with a simple value to value mapping and take it from there. So let's map that date over to the requested shipping date and hop on over to the expression editor for that element. Now, as you can see, you see the same square brackets that we saw with the static value earlier. And let me explain what this means. So each time you see square brackets in the application, that's basically the application saying whatever is inside those square brackets is some kind of function or formatter that needs evaluating, right? And in this case, we have the XPath function, and all that's doing is grabbing that DTM02 XPath from the source and evaluating that. And we know that value to be 2019-04-11, or the 11th of March, 11th of April 2019. But the requirement here is actually to concatenate that with the DTM03 element, which we know is 12 o'clock. So Matt, for that, we're going to actually have to add a new set of square brackets because we're going to be evaluating something dynamically. And this is where this dynamic content tab you see underneath, this is where that comes in. So to evaluate that DTM03 element dynamically, all we have to do is find that and click it, and it'll automatically populate the requisite function to have it be evaluated. So what I get is this resultant expression that concatenates both DTM02 and DTM03. Now, as I said, anything outside of these square brackets is going to be interpreted as a literal, right? Like we did with the customer name for Amazon. So for example, if you had the requirement to include a dash, for example, between the date and the time, you do that like so. But for this example, we just want to make it a simple concatenation. So let's keep it at that, and let's go ahead and save our changes. And that covers the dynamic content element of the expression editor.
Great. Thank you for that explanation, Ron. I do want to jump into the other major feature of the expression editor, the other tab, if you noticed, which is formatters. And formatters are essentially functions that manipulate, transform, do something to the data as it's being mapped. And these we find are oftentimes the more common use of the expression editor. So we are going to go through a few different examples. We have different types of formatters. We have math formatters, string formatters, date formatters, etc. And so we're going to go through one of each here. In order to motivate this use of formatters, I do want to direct your attention to a potential problem we have in this mapping. And that is, we have this line item total cost column in my line items table. So this, I know, naturally is going to be the multiplication of the quantity times the price. So however much it costs times however many I ordered. That will be the total cost. However, I also know that that total cost doesn't appear anywhere in the source document. I have the quantity and I have the price, but I don't have them multiplied together. So I can't simply drag and drop something from the source. I need to actually perform that multiplication during the mapping. So this is where we can introduce a math formatter like multiply. So multiply here is going to be the first formatter that I show you. And these formatters are all applied in the expression editor, so that's what we're going to use to do that. Like most of our expression editor features, this starts with a simple value-to-value mapping. So I can pick either the quantity, which I know is PO102, or the price, which I know is PO104, to start this value-to-value mapping. In this case, I'll just pick the quantity. And here I have my basic value-to-value mapping. And I'll bring up the expression editor to introduce this multiplication feature. So the first thing to understand about formatters, we can see a list here, is before I actually add the formatter to my expression, I need to know the basic syntax. And the basic syntax is very simple. Values are piped in to formatters using a vertical pipe character like this. So this is indicating that whatever value is returned from this XPath should be piped in as input to some formatter, some function that's going to manipulate it. In this case, the formatter that I want is multiply. So I can simply search this list for multiply and click it to add it here in the expression. The last thing I need is the parameter of the multiply. And for the multiply specifically, the parameter is the other value that I'm multiplying together. So I've already mapped the quantity. I want to multiply that with the price. So this parameter should be the price. But the price is more dynamic content. The price is coming from the source document. So I need to lean on what Ron just described to add this price as a second element in this same output mapping. So just like before, I'll add a new set of square brackets to indicate that I'm resolving a new variable. Then I'll find the element that I know corresponds to the price, which again is P0104, and click it here in the dynamic constant list to add it to the expression. So now we've got an expression that says, find the quantity value from this XPath, and then multiply it with the price value from this XPath. So this formatter, this multiply formatter, is performing some logic to the data to create a new value as it's being mapped.
Awesome. So that was basically what a math formatter is. And as Matt just mentioned, we actually have more than just math formatters. We have string formatters and date formatters and file formatters and so on. And I'd like to give you an example of string and datetime formatters specifically. So let's start off with a basic string. And for this, I'd like to use the gift message element of a source 850 document. And we know that's in the N9 loop one in the MSG segment. And we can see that that's the gift message we're looking to map. We also have a gift message in the destination. So Matt, let's go ahead and do that value to value mapping. Now, what kind of string formatter would I like to use here? And this really depends on what your requirements are. My requirement for my database is that I don't want any gift message that's longer than 100 characters. So I want to limit this gift message to 100 characters. So Matt, let's go ahead and jump into the expression editor and see what we can do here. So let's add a pipe in there. As you said, we need to pipe this into a formatter. And I know that we have a substring formatter that takes a string, such as a gift message, and creates a substring out of it. Now this substring formatter takes two parameters, the first being a zero-based index at which the substring starts. Now I don't mind where the gift message starts. I want it to start right at the beginning. So I'm going to start that off at the 0 index, which is the beginning of the message. But I want to restrict it to a maximum of 100 characters, which is the second parameter, which is the length of the string that I'm looking to create here. So let's go ahead and add 100 as the maximum here. And when I save those changes, what I'll be effectively doing is restricting any gift message across all my sales orders to a maximum of 100 characters. Let's take this one step further with a date time formatter. And actually this directly answers somebody's question who asked, would you please quickly demonstrate current date time formatting? So let's go ahead and answer that. And for this, I'd like to use the BEG05 element. Matt, you and I know that this is the order date or the date that this order was placed. And we also have an order date in the destination field. Let's go ahead and map that. And once we map it, we can think about, all right, what do I want this date to look like? Now, the way I like looking at my dates in the SQL Server database is in a specific format where I like having a two-digit day followed by a two-digit month followed by a four-digit year. As we can see in the BEG05 segment, this is not the format it's following, and it has 2019-04-11. So I need to take that format and change it. So Matt, let's jump into the expression editor once again, and let's pipe this into a formatter. And the formatter we're going to use now is a toDate formatter, which is a simple formatter that takes a datetime variable, such as the BEG05 segment, and changes the structure of it. So changes how we're looking at that datetime. And as I said, I like having a two-digit day followed by a two-digit month followed by a four-digit year. And that's exactly what I'm going to specify my output format as. I personally like seeing hyphens or dashes between the date and the month and the year. So that's exactly what I've done. Now, Matt, let's go back into the editor and address this user's question directly and talk about a second datetime formatter. And we don't need to put this in, but let's just search for it. I think it's called now. Right, and now is basically a formatter that searches the system for the current date time, and then you can obviously specify an output format for that. So the user who asked about the current date and time, you'd use the now formatter for that. Okay, and actually, yeah, we've been called out by Giorgio, who says that the right substring range should be from 0 to 99 instead of 0 to 100. And he's absolutely correct. So we've designed this to be 101 characters. Thank you. Thanks, Giorgio. Nice call out there.
Hopefully this doesn't break our database column. Um,
It'll be fine.
so I do want to jump into the final feature of the expression editor that we'll be covering today. So right now we focused on manipulating values, using formatters and dynamic content to change how this data shows up in our output. This last feature is very important, but it is a slight departure from that concept. And this concept I want to introduce is called look-aheads. And in order to motivate this concept of look-aheads to understand why you might use it, what they do, I want to focus in on the in-one loop elements here in my source. So you'll notice that they repeat. There are 3 of them right here. And I know from my knowledge of EDI documents that an in-one loop represents a party, as in a an entity in the sales order exchange. So it might be a bill to party, it might be a ship to party, who knows. So when I'm mapping a value like shipping street, I know that this value is going to come from one of these in-one loops, because those in-one loops house all the information about each party. But there are multiple of them, and I only want the specific one for the ship to party. I can't map the street address for the bill to party as the shipping street. It wouldn't work. So the question is, well, how do I know which in-one loop to map this specific shipping street from? And this introduces the idea of a look-ahead. So how do we know which in-one loop is the shipping party? The answer is this in101 element. It has an ST, a code for ship to, if this is describing the ship to party. So I want to look ahead. I want to look into my in1 loops to see if in101 is ST. And if it is, I know I'm dealing with the correct in1 loop, so that then I can map the shipping street address. So this idea of a look ahead is I have several different segments. They're each slightly different, and I only want a value from one of them. So I can look into them to figure out which one is the one that I want, and then map some other value. So let's implement this, and hopefully if that hasn't sunk in yet, it'll be a little bit clearer once we're looking at it. So like most things, this starts with a simple value to value mapping, and then we'll add the look ahead condition in the expression editor. So the shipping street, well, that's the street address. I know the street address comes from M301, so I'll simply start with this value to value mapping. Now bring up the expression editor to introduce the look ahead condition. So the problem with what we have right now is this 2. This 2 in the escaped square brackets, and you'll notice they're escaped, so this isn't another set of dynamic content. This is a reserved format or reserved syntax here. This 2 within these escaped square brackets is an index. It's saying the second in1 loop, because in my source data, it happened to be the second in1 loop that had the value that I want. But of course, we can't be sure of that. We can't use that as a rule. We need to make sure we're looking for the in1 loop that has ST in the in101 element. So instead of this 2 in the square brackets, I'm going to insert a look ahead condition. The way I do that is I provide the path to the code that I'm trying to check. The code that I'm trying to check is in101. That's what's going to tell me if I'm in the right spot. So let's provide the path to that in101 element. As you can see, it's in1 loop to in1 to in101. So now I have this path to the value that I'm looking to check. And I want to know if that value is ST. So I can simply add this equals condition here, still within those square brackets, those escaped square brackets, to provide this conditional expression. So at this point, the look ahead is done. So let's look at the 2 halves of this expression. The first half of this expression is a regular value mapping. Let's pretend that these square brackets didn't exist. We just had this in1 loop, in3, and 301. That's a regular value. That's just reading a value from the source document. These escaped square brackets are the other half. This is saying, well, hold on, don't just unconditionally map in1 loop, in3, and 301. Specifically find the in1 loop that has in101 equal to ST, and then continue doing what you're doing. So this is discriminating between different in1 loops based on this element before mapping a different element, namely this one. So hopefully it's clear, especially when talking about different addresses or different parties in an exchange, why it's very useful to be able to discriminate which one we're talking about. So with that, I think we've covered each of the major features of the expression editor, and we've learned how to manipulate and transform our data. So Ron, do you mind giving us a bit of a recap of what we've talked about so far?
Absolutely. So we've thrown a lot of content at our viewers here. So I think it's going to be worthwhile to just take a step back and review everything that we've discussed today. So right at the start of the webinar, we spoke about dividing this use case, this end-to-end EDI integration use case, into 3 modules. We covered one in the first webinar and another one in the second webinar. And today we were discussing the EDI translation and mapping module. We broke that down into 2 discrete steps. First, we had the EDI translation step, and we think we covered that with our range of EDI connectors, such as the X12 and EDIFACT connectors that we showcased. And in this example, it's the X12 connector that does the heavy lifting of translating into XML. Then we talked about the second step, which was the XML mapping step, which included mapping XML from one structure to another. We talked about having these source and destination files, which for us were the EDI translated XML on the left and the template from the database on the right. And we gave you a brief tour of all of the different mapping features that this XML map connector supports. We talked about a simple drag and drop relationship between parent nodes to create for each relationships, and between leaf nodes to create direct value to value mappings. We talked about including conditionals, and then we went into the expression editor to put in some static values, some dynamic content, and use some formatters to manipulate the data. Lastly, Matt capped it all off with a discussion of looking ahead into specific loops to make sure that the data you're pulling out is exactly the data that you're looking for. So as I said, that's a lot of detail, but I hope that showcases to you just how robust and flexible of a tool Arc is. And I hope that that makes you realize that it actually gives the control of all of the data right back to you, the user. And I think there's no better way to wrap up this 3-part webinar series with what we've been working towards this whole time, which is seeing the data flow in from Amazon and right into the database, and then flow out from the database and right back to Amazon.
All right, so let's put this flow to work. So I uploaded a testx12 file here in this connector a little bit earlier, but at that point I hadn't configured the rest of the flow. So it just spat it right back out in this output tab. Now that I've connected this flow, the application knows to pass this data along to the next connector. And when I input another test file, it will simply pass all the way through to my database. So I'm going to do that again with my same test 850, and I'll send it through. So this is translated into XML by this X12 connector. And once the X12 connector has translated to XML, it passes that XML along to the XML Map connector. And I've defined this mapping relationship in my XML Map connector, so it knows how to translate that EDI XML into database XML, the XML from my database input. So if I see that XML file here in the input tab, it's already been processed. I have automation enabled. So it has already mapped it to the database format. And then since it's connected, it has passed it along to my database connector, the SQL Server connector, and it's sitting here. It's actually also already been sent, since I have automation enabled, to insert this data into my sales order tables. Now, if you're not sure about how this whole XML file turning into a database insert works, then please do check out our second webinar. We show a little bit of that visually arriving in the database table. But there has been, so this is a demonstration of how that starting X12 file, that same file in X12 format we started with, turns into an insert into a database. However, there has been the other half of this flow we haven't talked very much about, which is the outbound half. So we have already prepared 2 connectors here, and you might remember I got confused by one of them, to do this outbound logic. So we've already configured a mapping that maps many of the values here. It's got the relevant invoice data corresponding to our purchase orders. This is what we'd like to send back out to Amazon. So we received their purchase orders. We'd now like to send them the corresponding invoices. So I already have prepared these connectors for the sake of brevity in this demonstration. I'll connect them up in a flow like this and save the changes. And now when I output data from my SQL Server database, it similarly is going to get passed along the flow, And each of these data translation and mapping steps will be applied. So let's walk through that very quickly. So first, I have my output template set to a test invoice table that I set up, and I know this has a single record in it for testing. So I'll go ahead and pull that one record from my invoice table, and this naturally will get passed along to my XML Map connector. And my XML Map connector knows the relationship between this input XML, which is from my database this time, and the output XML, which this time is the EDI data. So you'll notice this is exactly inverse from what we were just working on. It's converting database into EDI instead of EDI into database. So this mapping relationship is all set up. So it will have already processed this file with automation enabled to map this into an EDI XML. Then my X12 connector will receive that EDI XML, and it will convert it, since it's in XML to X12 mode, convert it into an outbound X12 document. So we can see that we had my send error from the original mishap, but we have that invoice data, you can tell by the file name here, that I just pulled out, that is translated into an X12 file and passed along to the AS2 connector to be sent out to Amazon. And just as a final little note, I can open up this invoice that is now translated into X12 and show everybody that our database data now looks very much like an X12 file. So hopefully those two demonstrations help show how this X12 format can get converted into a database insert, and similarly a database extract can get converted into X12 to be sent out to your trading partners. And Ron, I think that pretty much covers our full end-to-end EDI integration. I'm not sure that we have too much left prepared here. Do we have any questions from the audience, or would you like to end with some closing remarks before we go to the Q&A?
So I think you hit the nail on the head, Matt. Both of these demonstrations hopefully showcase to everybody how to set up an EDI end-to-end EDI integration using ArcESB. As I said, this is something we've been working towards for 3 webinars, and I think this was a fitting conclusion. I'd like to take a moment just to thank all of our viewers for joining in and sparing the time to do this. We really appreciate that. And more than anything, I hope you've learned a great deal about ArcESB and about just how easy it is to set something like this up by yourself. At this point, I'd like to open the floor up to you all, to the viewers, for any questions that you might have. I can see that we already have, I think, 9 questions in the Q&A, so we're going to take them one by one and start answering them. But if you do have more questions, please keep them coming. We're more than happy to stay as long as needed. So, Matt, without further ado, I think we should start answering some of these questions.
All right.
Okay, so the first question is coming from an anonymous attendee who would like to see multiple if and else conditions. I think we should probably talk about the scripting features, Matt.
Okay, yes. So we showed most of the designer-driven tools here in the XML Map connector to provide a range of use cases. We did leave off this custom script feature. So this is a very flexible ability to write some custom script during the mapping. So if you have use cases that don't quite fit into the other features as exposed by the XML Map connector, then you can always write some custom script to get the job done. And in this case, if the conditionals that we have aren't enough, if maybe it's sort of like a select case idea where you need to check various different conditions to determine what to do, then you can use the scripting logic to do this fairly simply. And for the specific case of like multiple if conditionals, which is like a select case statement, I will mention that we include with our scripting features this ability to add some pre-written snippets. So, this doesn't cover every use case, but in this case, a select case is a snippet that you can simply insert. And so you will need to modify this for your specific needs, but this is showing the general logic for checking a particular value, in this case, the transaction code, and determining what to do if it's any particular value, like an 810 or an 850. This example is simply logging information, but hopefully it's clear how you can use this skeleton to implement the logic that you need. So if the conditional support that we have directly in the UI is not quite advanced enough for what you need, then you can always check out our scripting features to implement that directly.
Awesome, Matt. So let's actually stay in here for just a second because they provided a great answer for another question actually. But for this particular user, I would like to show them one of our existing snippets. So let's get rid of the select case. And somebody did ask about a switch case usage, and this is exactly what you would do. But Matt, let's add a snippet for a simple if else comparison, a string comparison or whatever, right? So as you can see, the scripting language has if and else clauses built into it, and you can nest as many of these as you want. So I hope that answers your question about multiple if and else. And if it makes more sense for you to use a switch case, which was somebody else's question, then you have the ability to do that as well. Okay, Matt, the next question is also from an anonymous attendee who would like to know how they can pull a value from a database for the destination file. Okay, so this is very interesting. And I mean, since the tool is so flexible, you really have multiple ways of doing this, but I'll go ahead and answer with the way that I think is the cleanest. And I think it is to actually use a connector that's built just for this purpose. So Matt, let's go ahead and pull up a lookup connector. So as you can see, we have, several different connectors that do different things. And this particular connector lookup does just that, where you can specify a data source to look up from. And we have SQL Server already configured. And then you can specify the XPath in the incoming document that you'd like to populate with your lookup query. So for example, say you had this test element that you wanted to populate with a specific lookup query, you'd specify that XPath and whatever query that you want, and you'd be able to do that like so. I hope that answers that. And if there's a follow-up, please do let me know. Okay, Jeff is asking if you can have multiple look-ahead conditions in a mapping. Sometimes you need to find multiple locations to look for a SKU number in item detail, but it can be in 05, 07, 09, or 011, which will show SK.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
question. I'm going to go ahead and bring up this expression editor to show what goes on. So the location of these square brackets is important here. So these are, again, escape square brackets, so they're not the same as dynamic content, but these square brackets are indicating which elements you're discriminating between. And by that, I mean, I talked a bit about in-one loops and how they contain different parties, and we need to pick out a specific in-one loop out of all of them. So the fact that these escape square brackets are right adjacent to the in-one loop indicates that this look ahead is discriminating between different in-one loops. If you're discriminating between different elements, like more than one element, then you would simply add another set of escape square brackets and another look ahead condition next to, right after, whichever other element you're discriminating between. So if I had multiple in3s, which doesn't quite make sense, but if I had multiple in3s in here, I could add another look ahead condition here next to in3 to discriminate between each of those. So if you need multiple look aheads, you simply add more of these escape square bracket syntax to the expression.
Right, but let's take this just a step further. And I think Jeff's question in particular was about what if, say he's looking for the SK, right? We were looking for a ship to in the N1 loop, right? But let's say he's looking for the SK qualifier, which could be in N105, N107, N109, or N111. I think this is a perfect use case for our scripting language, Jeff, where you'd be able to specify which set of XPaths you want to search for that SK qualifier. And we just went ahead and showed you how the if else and select case terminology works, but you'd use something like that to check all of those elements. And if one of them is SK, you can go into whatever mapping that you want to create for that. I hope that answers your question, Jeff. Okay, another anonymous attendee, Matt, who's asking about the underscore index element. That's a keen eye that they caught that.
Yeah, okay, so I didn't mention this because it's part of a connector we configured ahead of time to save some time. We know this is going on a while anyway. They must have noticed in this XML map connector creating those outbound invoices that one of these elements, let's see, oh yeah, STO2, has underscore index. So what does this mean? Well, this is a reserved syntax. So if I bring this up in the expression editor, first of all, you'll note that it's within these square brackets. So it's not the literal string underscore index, obviously. It's a reserved syntax that is the index of the most local for each loop. So what does that mean? So this element, STO2, is within my TX element. And this TX element has a for each loop that it's associated with. For every invoice, I want a new transaction set. So this for each is going to loop for however many invoices is in my source document. And this underscore index is just going to capture the index of the current loop starting at 1. So this STO2 is going to be set to 1 the first time we find an invoice in the source document, and each consecutive time that this for each loop loops, it will increment. So this makes sense for STO2 since STO2 is the transaction control number. It's essentially just like a line number for each of the transactions. So this provides a unique value for each of your TX elements by just capturing the index of the for each loop.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. A couple more questions left. An interesting one about version control, which I think is useful considering just how detailed this XML map is. So this person is asking, is there any version control for these flows? Two different answers to this question. First of all, we have the ability for you to save these and create backups of your flows by exporting the entire workspace. So if you are concerned about losing all of your data, you can actually go ahead and export everything that you've configured. And what it'll do is it'll export a .arcflow file. And a .arcflow file is basically a zip file that contains all of the necessary settings that ArcESB needs to create that workspace again. And all you really need to do is drag and drop that into ArcESB so that you can make sure you have a backup of all of your settings. The second answer to this question is actually specific to the XML map connector. So every time you create a new rule, or Matt, let's open that XML map connector up. And so every time you click save, what's happening behind the scenes is that it's creating a new file in the application files. And considering the XML map connector is a very involved connector, we tend to keep, what is it, Matt, like 5 or 10 of the latest saves that you made there? Is that right?
I'd have to check, but something like that.
Yeah, something like that. So there are backup files created for the XML map specifically. So there's two different answers there. One, you can export your workflows. Two, for the XML map connector specifically, we do have a version control built into the mapping files themselves.
I do want to jump in here at the end. If you have your own version system that you'd like to integrate with these mapping relationships, since this map really is just a JSON file underneath, the JSON file contains all of the relationships here. You can simply add that JSON file on disk to whatever versioning system you have. You can version that file. So if, since all of the configuration here is simply file-based, there's no magic happening behind the scenes where you have to dig into the application. It's all just on the file system. If you just want to add the JSON file that is the map to your version control, then you will have effectively versioned this configuration.
Awesome. Okay, I think there are a few simple questions, Matt, that we can answer before wrapping up in the interest of time. Cody is asking if there's any limit to the number of workspaces you can have, and Cody, the simple answer is no. You can create just as many workspaces as you need. I'm sure Matt has several different workspaces on his machine, but yep, no limits whatsoever. You can just keep creating them. The application comes with a default workspace, but after that, there are no limits whatsoever. Okay, we had a comment from Lee Dennis about the BEG segment and how we would change it to an SA for a standalone versus a DS for a dropship. Thanks for that comment, Lee. I guess for this example, for this demonstration, it's not very pertinent because we were trying to display the features of the application, but your comment is very much appreciated. Thank you. And another anonymous user, Matt, is asking about, this is a nice question, about the name Arc and where it was derived from. Nice question, I guess. Again, a couple of different answers. The word Arc means a couple of different things. Uh, One thing I like to think about is a large arc under which all of these different functionalities and connectors and capabilities exist. So a large arc that covers a wide amount of functionality. That's one. And of course, an electrical arc is extremely rapid. And that's what we like to think about when we think about data processing, that you can do it rapidly and very easily using ArcESB. Thanks for that question. All right, Matt, I think that wraps up the number of questions we can answer today. We've been, our viewers have been extremely patient, and thank you so much for their time today. I think that's all from us today. Matt, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I hope this was helpful. And if you guys have further questions, specific mappings that you want to help with, simply email us at support@arcesb.com, and we're happy to provide tailored advice.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care and see you next time.
Thank you.